I went to the specially called general conference in 2019, and there you have Westboro Baptist, on the other corner of the street, screaming at everybody going into the United Methodist General Session, calling all of us fags and queers and God hates you. I mean, just talk about, getting hit from kind of all sides, from progressive, pro-gay theology folks to Westboro Baptist screaming at us from the other corner. So it's been an interesting time.
I love being at the New Room conferences under Seedbed's spurring on of gathering us all with what we have in common in Wesleyan theology. And equipping that, I just thought that was a brilliant move on their part once I understood more about Wesleyanism. And it makes total sense that this is the direction the Holy Spirit's moving us all in, is not just away from the United Methodist chaos, that the political infighting, but moving towards a greater working out, living out of going back to the Methodist roots, of going back to those Wesleyan roots. And that's something all these different denominations have in common.
God opened my eyes to see that the issue was far more than arguing over same-sex attraction, but that the church is full of people who have been sexually abused or are addicted to pornography. The issue is way, way, way bigger.
Well, hey, we are so excited for you to join us. If you're an audience that is listening to the podcast through Transforming Congregations, this will be our very first podcast episode. If you're listening to Love and Truth Network podcast, this will be, I'm not sure, maybe 12 or 15 in our podcast lineup so far. And we're really excited for you to join us for this discussion. I'm joined today by Debra Baty as well as Mark Ongley, and really excited. We've worked together on a significant project within the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church, or the Wesleyan Covenant Association, I should say. And we are really excited about you being able to tune in for our discussion. The main topic today, we might go down some rabbit trails. If you listen to my podcast very often, you'll recognize that that's often the case, but it's sometimes those bunny trails wind up leading to some really good things. So the main topic, though, that we're emphasizing today is on doing ministry with regard to restoring sexual and relational wholeness within more of a pan-Wesleyan perspective, to not just within the United Methodist Church or hopefully in the future the Global Methodist Church or within the Wesleyan Covenant Association, but beyond that to other Wesleyan movements like the Free Methodist Church and the Nazarene Church and others. We want to be a resource and an encouragement, and really offering some equipping and training where needed, and just really helping to support the church. We believe that the church is God's plan A, and that parachurch ministry, when it's doing its best work, is really supporting the church, not siphoning people, off from the church who've been hurt by the church. So that's going to be part of our discussion. But to get started, as is always the case, if you've listened to us or watched the podcast before, we want to share a little bit of our story with you. So I'm going to be really brief. Some of you have probably already heard my story. I grew up in a Christian home in the upstate New York area, but at the same time, I was exposed to hardcore porn by some older neighborhood boys, as well as their sexual behavior. One of the devastating realities of pornography is that it often it does kind of twist our thinking and our perspective around sexuality, even around relationships. And so often what we see in pornography, we eventually want to act out in some fashion. And that was certainly true of what happened to me in that sexual abuse experience. And so from the earliest time that I can remember, like I can't even think back to a time that my mind wasn't polluted by sexual garbage and by pornography. So hitting puberty, I was a porn addict, wrestling with all of this in the context of a church, but there was no safe place to go to talk with anyone about that. It wasn't really safe to talk with my parents about it either. Good people, but had no clue what to do about this. And the message for so many within the church has simply been stop it, don't do it. and there's not been real help or support in the whys and the hows and those kinds of things. So that's part of what we want to talk about today. But when I eventually went to Bible college and eventually got kicked out of Bible college because they were concerned that I might be suicidal. They didn't really have the means of walking with somebody dealing with those kinds of deep issues. And so I left Bible college, and I was just so angry with God and the church, so frustrated. Why hadn't God shown up and answered my prayers to change my life and change my desires and perspectives? And eventually I found my first gay bar. I wasn't really looking for it. Someone made an offhanded comment about it, and then I was looking for it. Once I found out that there was something somewhere nearby, I was like a moth to the flame. And I eventually, at 19 years of age, I went into my first gay bar, and I felt like the gay community, I finally found my people with them. I didn't feel like I fit into my family. I didn't fit in the church. I didn't fit into Bible college. But I fit in here is what it felt like. So for a number of years, I embraced a full-on gay identity. I became a bartender at a gay club, and just, again, fully embraced that life, just feeling like it was such a relief to finally stop battling my desires, and so I was done, and I was angry with God, but the Lord is incredibly faithful, and it is His kindness that leads us to repentance, as Romans 2 says, which that verse used to make me angry when I'd read it because I didn't feel like there was really much that was kind about God. But the God that I grew up somehow interpreting in my own mind was anything but the true God of the Bible. And so He did pursue me. He did find me and drew me in an authentic relationship for the first time ever into an authentic relationship with Jesus. And the story goes on from there. There's lots that I could share. I'll just jump forward. Melissa, my wife, and I have been married for 16 years in September of 2023. And we have two boys that are 12 and 15. And I mean, I never thought in a million years I'd ever want to be married to a woman. I never thought that I wanted to be a father. And yet those are two of the greatest joys of my life today. So God is incredibly faithful, incredibly gracious. And we want to talk about some of that today. So, Dee, Mark, thanks so much for being here and joining us for this podcast. The three of us get to do together.
Very good.
Yeah. Dee, would you mind just kind of introducing yourself a little bit and sharing a little of your testimony?
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey and in a semi-Christian home. I became a Christian early, about maybe 7 or so. I heard that if you accept Christ as your Savior, you won't go to hell. And I thought that sounds like a great deal to me, and did not really understand much beyond that until I went to actually a Christian camp. About 13 years old, I started catching on that there's more to this salvation than just fire insurance, that there is a real life commitment, that the Lordship of Christ started hitting home when I saw other people around me making changes in their life based on their faith. And I thought, oh, this is deeper, and was really encouraged by their example and rededicated my life to the Lord around 13. Around that same time also, though, I started noticing I was attracted to women in ways that other girls around me were not experiencing, and did not know what to do with that. There was no place to go for, this is the dark ages before the internet, did not know where to go for help. The hints that I'd heard from psychology seemed really not interesting and dangerous to me. I did not want to just go in and be experimented on. So I was avoiding letting anyone know because I was scared of what would happen if people knew outside the church or inside the church. And eventually, I studied the scripture on my own. The church did not have anything to say about sexuality at all, which I look back on as kind of a blessing because we didn't have scapegoating occurring there, but also I was just very left isolated and alone. So I read the scriptures on my own and saw, okay, this is not something God approves of me pursuing, but I didn't know what to do beyond that. And eventually the Lord, He just kept His hand on my life. Eventually I went to a church when I went to grad school in Center City, Philadelphia. I went to 10th Presbyterian Church in Center City there, and they had a support group ministry called Harvest USA. Well, they did more than support groups. They did a lot, and they still do a lot. They're still active. And I went to their group and found tremendous hope and all the help I was longing for. It's the first time anyone ever prayed with me regarding this struggle in my life, which to me was bizarre that you could pray for anything in the church, but something that was the deepest struggle of my heart. It was a safe place to go. They asked open-ended questions. We prayed together. We dug through scripture together. They never promised that they would fix everything. They never promised that my desires would change. It was just a place to have an opportunity to work through with other mature believers. And they didn't have any kind of fancy tricks or experimental formulas to play with there. It was just very open. And if something applied to you, great. If it didn't apply to you, no big deal. We just were able to support one another and press through. So it was a wonderful experience to go through that group. So I went there for about a year and a half, and about 8 years later, I started noticing changes in my attractions and desires to where I was attracted to men. And there's a lot of stuff that went on in between there that I've written about elsewhere. But I started noticing a change in my attractions and desires. About 10 years after that, I met the man I would eventually marry, and we've been married for about 11 years. So I spent a lot of time as a single adult until I was 41. So I have a great heart for singleness as a state of being for everyone that everyone experiences in the church.
Yes.
And just how churches can, I've seen good examples of how churches can work with singles and bad examples, but I've also had really good experiences with counseling and see what that looks like. I know we've heard a lot of horror stories of bad counseling experiences, but mine was a very good one. So I like sharing the good things that I experienced, I was blessed with, so that others can be encouraged to do something similar. Because these are complicated, deep issues, as Garry and Mark well know, that there's not bumper sticker approaches and formulas don't really work because we're complicated people. So I again was blessed that I had an opportunity to go to counseling that had that in mind, that could absorb the complicatedness of different people's experiences. So fast forward, I've been writing a newsletter since 2016 called Resources for Redemption. And that is there to help people, to equip people to speak the gospel fluently, truthfully, and kindly related to sexuality and gender. It started as an outreach to my pastors on staff, and they kept encouraging me to write more, and word of mouth spread through other pastors, through counselors, through lay leaders. And now it's being read by people on several continents and Christian college presidents and, again, counselors and laypersons. It's been a private newsletter, so just by word of mouth. But as of June 1st, Lord willing, it's going to go public. So I'm excited about that new opportunity, so that others will be able to access that starting again June 1st. So through that newsletter writing, I became volunteering. I became involved with the Wesleyan Covenant Association. I was a charter member when they started in 2016. I was there at the Chicago meeting, which was phenomenal, and joined again as a member, and then was invited to be on the Global Council. And I've served on a couple task forces there, the Accountable Discipleship Task Force, and then was put on the Global Council. I don't know if that came first or... I became on the Global Council after the Accountable Discipleship Task Force, and then was the chair of the Sexual Holiness, and Brokenness. I might have that out of order, task force, but I just call it the Sexuality Task Force for short.
Yes.
And served with you all. there, which was a phenomenal experience, along with a few other gentlemen that joined us on that team. So that's my involvement here. I should also put in a note, although we might talk about this later. I grew up in a Methodist church. Again, that was silent on these issues. Went into other denominations, Presbyterian, Calvary Chapel, found a great home church there, and then came back to the Methodist church when I married a Methodist, and who's from a family of Methodists. So in 2012 is when I came back to the Methodist church through marriage. So just in time for all this controversy to explode. And again, very thankful for the involvement of so many people in the Wesleyan Covenant Association and the work that they've done collectively, as well as the work we'll talk about it, I'm sure, Seedbed has done just to help unite a pan-Wesleyan perspective that, again, we'll talk about later today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Yeah, there are so many things, Dee, that you said that I really love and appreciate. If we have time today, we'll see how it goes, but I would love to at least explore a little bit because I have this similar heart for the church ministering in a way that's effective and rich with regard to singleness, and because it's a stage, as you said, that all of us go through, and some of us are called to that actually. And how do we treat that as a gift and not a disease? And really support people in their stages of singleness, whatever that looks like, even if they're made single by death or divorce or what have you. How does the church really come alongside of people in those stages? So that may be actually, that's certainly plenty of material for an entirely future podcast for sure. The other thing that you mentioned is your email that you're doing, the writing that you're doing. And Mark and I can both vouch for the fact that you are a wonderful writer and very thorough and a great researcher. So anybody would be blessed and well-informed by getting connected with what you're doing. So could you, do you know right now how people could get connected with you in what you're writing or in some other fashion that you'd like to communicate with them?
Yeah, right now you can email me at resources, the number 4 and the letter R. So it's resources4r@gmail.com. There'll be a Substack, Resources for Redemption, available starting June 1st. So if you look up Resources for Redemption through Substack, should be the only one that pops up.
Great. The other thing that you mentioned, I just want to comment on, I know of some people that have not had great counseling or a great counseling experience dealing with sexual brokenness, dealing with pornography addiction, heterosexual, dealing with identity issues for sure. And I know some that haven't had a great like small group experience or support group experience. But what I also want to say is for, similar to what you're communicating, my small group experiences, the counseling that I have had, both lay and some professional, has been just rich and beautiful and absent of empty promises and those kinds of things, but just people walking alongside of one another in a way that's loving and grace-filled. And I've talked to so many people who have had that experience far more than have had the experience of a negative experience, either in support groups or in counseling. Again, those experiences have happened, but I feel like the narrative that we hear is almost always negative. And yet for the hundreds of people that I know, by name, and my wife and I know, there are very few stories there's lots of stories of brokenness within the church and how the church hasn't handled this well, which is one of the reasons we're talking. But in terms of counseling and support groups, the vast majority of what I've heard has been very, very positive. So, anyhow, let's, Mark, we'd love to hear from you just a little bit about who you are. And you've written a couple of books too that are excellent in relationships and sexuality. And so if you'd mention those, and also how people, and also you do a regular blog too, Tsunami Surfing, I believe. Can you just communicate a little bit about that and share some of your own story?
Yeah, let me start with the story first. I I grew up in a small denomination called the Evangelical United Brethren, which was very Wesleyan in its history. Eventually, they merged with the Methodist Church and became United Methodist. That was in 1968, and at that time, I guess I was about 11 years old, and I remember my very conservative pastor preaching against becoming Methodist and all the things that he didn't like, and mentioning foremost the issues of abortion and homosexuality. And then we felt like we were kind of swamped by a much larger denomination, and I think that pastor planted some seeds of anger and discord, and so I went to college. I started going to a Wesleyan church in college, and my grandmother had been praying that I would be a minister. I resisted that call until right before my senior year of college, and the pastors at the Wesleyan church said, "You ought to go to Asbury." So I applied to Asbury. I also, that next summer, started to attend a Christian Missionary Alliance church. And that pastor said, "You ought to be Christian Missionary Alliance." I said, "Okay." So I went to Asbury. I started to attend an Alliance church in the Lexington area. And the pastor of my church, my home church, the church I grew up in, he had been Methodist all his life, very strong evangelical. And he wrote me a letter when I was in my first year at seminary. It said, "Don't let the Methodist Church go to the devil." And so I thought, okay, well, I'll at least give it a shot. And so my first semester at Asbury, this would have been the fall of '79, I heard about a good news meeting. And when I went to it, I didn't see much good news. It was just all the arguing about legislation and strategy and preparing for the 1980 General Conference. And I just thought, this is not what I want to do in ministry. I just want to preach, make disciples, had an interest in mission work. So I just thought, nope. I jumped in with the Christian Missionary Alliance. My wife and I, we became missionary candidates with the Alliance, and then God closed the door to overseas work, began to minister in the CMA, and was an Alliance pastor for 11 or 8 years. And then I had an offer to come on staff of a large United Methodist church back in my home state of Western PA, and I turned it down at first. I just thought, I don't want to be United Methodist. All they do is argue about homosexuality, and I don't care. Well, I cared. I found myself very conservative, but I just felt like that's not what I want to give my life to. And God just very dramatically led me back to the United Methodist Church, hired on staff of that church. And I thought, well, I'll give this 2 or 3 years and I'll go back to the Alliance. But when I was pastoring in the CMA, I had 2 gay men attending my church, and they both approached me asking if I could help them find healing. And I was clueless. So I began to read about Leanne Payne, and I read about inner healing with David Seaman's work. And I finally said, I'll be your friend, I'll disciple you, but you need to go to a ministry. And I pointed them to a ministry like yours, Garry, Love and Truth Network. And so going back to the United Methodist Church, it was different. I was still conservative, but now I had friends that were gays, and the fighting over homosexuality, it just was like, I am conservative, but I want to do more than defend a theological castle. I want us to do ministry and try to help people. And so I started a newsletter, and which we had to physically address and physically put in the mail. Sent it to 600 United Methodist churches in our conference with fear and trembling. But after probably 4 years of that, 4.5 years of doing that, I just felt a very strong calling from God to learn how to equip churches to do ministry. And I thought, oh my gosh, how am I going to do that if I can read books about inner healing. I don't know how to do inner healing. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, one of the books that I'd read was by Terry Wardle, who was, at that time, when he wrote it, he was Christian Missionary Alliance, but it was on inner healing, and he was teaching at Ashland Seminary. So I went into his Doctor of Ministry program, learned about inner healing ministry, and oh my world changed. God opened my eyes to see that the issue was far more than arguing over same-sex attraction, but that the church is full of people who have been sexually abused or are addicted to pornography. Mm-hmm. The issue is way, way, way bigger. And so in the inner healing prayer, in what Wardle calls formational counseling, people started to show up. And I did have a few gays and lesbians, but by far, I've prayed with hundreds of people who've been sexually abused. And I don't know how many, the number of porn addicts is escalating. And in the process, I began to recognize my own sexual brokenness. I attracted to women, so hey, I must be okay. Just kind of blind. I call it a heterosexual blindness. I must be okay. Well, I began to realize, no, things are not all okay. And I had a man who had been a male prostitute for men. He'd been horribly, horribly sexually abused as a toddler and a young boy. And he said, all these abuse victims come to you. You must have been sexually abused. And I said, I don't really think so. There was this time when I was touched inappropriately, and this man who had been so profoundly sexually abused practically jumped out of his chair and said, "You're an abuse victim. You need to own it. You need to come out of your denial." I thought, okay. And so I began to own that and recognizing some addiction in my own life to masturbation as a young man, and for which I found freedom from through inner healing prayer. So since then, as you mentioned, Gary, had the opportunity to write 2 books, both published by Seedbed, Into the Light, which is the broad picture kind of a book. There's a theology of sexuality listed in there. There's also, it's applied to abuse and addiction and adultery, and yes, to same-sex attraction. But it is just really a challenge to the church to get equipped and start to do what you can instead of always referring. And then tsunami surfing is like Debra's blog is on Substack. In fact, Debra helped me figure out Substack and how to do that. It's a blog for pastors and counselors to know how to navigate what is really a deluge of sexual brokenness hitting our culture.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. What is the best way for them to find? I mean, they can get on Substack, but what is the best way for them to find you, Mark?
I have a very simple website. It's Mark Ongley, ONGLEY.com. MarkOngley.com. There to list the books. I'll link for the website, or I'll link for the blog and other things.
Okay. Awesome. That's great. Well, thanks for sharing, both of you. I appreciate that.
I forgot
yes.
something. I just feel so very, very blessed to be working with the two of you. To me, it's just like kind of like the crowning phase of where God's been leading me, and I just love the experience and the training and all the rest that you both bring. So let me throw that on there too.
Well, I think we feel the same. So I know I feel the same, and I'm sure Dee's nodding her head as well. So
Yep.
It's been a real joy to connect and be able to work together, and certainly is something I look at as a gift from the Lord. Really, the more that we can, that sense of having support and being able to, run a sanity check by somebody. And, I'm often reaching out to Dee for one thing or another. Mark, I've reached out to you and traveling through your area, and you've opened up opportunity for me to do some ministry and things at your church. And it's just been a really great connection, I think, all the way around.
Amen.
The one thing I'll use again, said a lot of great things, Mark, in what you're sharing as well, that could open up some rabbit trails to go down. And you mentioned good news in that, and I totally get what you're talking about in terms of the UMC just has really been embroiled for many years over. Honestly, LGBT is not the only issue. It's been the presenting issue. It's been kind of the point of the spear. But they're the basics of do we believe the Bible? Do we believe that Jesus is the Son of God and Jesus is the only way of salvation? I mean, there's some really basic vital questions that are kind of up for grabs depending on who you're talking to within the UMC, whether they are progressive, so-called progressive, or what have you, or orthodox. And so the my experience with Good News began back in 2016 when I was asked by my predecessor Karen Booth, who oversaw Transforming Congregations, this renewal ministry within the UMC, if I would consider taking her role. My wife and I always chuckled when we'd see Karen at a conference and she was going to retire, and the next year she was there again, and the year after that, and the year, but eventually it got to a point where she really did need to, and just to take care of family and things of that nature. And so, because I was already running Love and Truth Network to the broader church, and I would have been happy to minister as Love and Truth Network within the UMC too, this opportunity to work with a renewal ministry that had been involved for 30 plus years within the UMC seemed like a no-brainer after praying about it. And so, my experience, I'm the only one on this podcast who's not a United Methodist, and I feel like a little bit of a mutt among pedigree when I'm in some of the Wesleyan circles, because there's so much history, there's so much richness, there's a lot of knowledge around not just Christianity, but of course Wesleyanism, and that's been a gift to me as well. That's been a blessing. But in my experience with Good News and them overseeing Transforming Congregations, I've been so blessed by their approach to and the conversations I've heard about, again, not just wanting to kind of thump on truth, but rather to really minister, to hold to the truth, because if we lose the truth, then we lose everything else, but to hold to the truth, but also to do it in a way that is whimsical and inviting and really produces human thriving when we follow the scriptures, when we obey what God calls us to. So again, my involvement with the staff and the board of Good News has been a really overwhelmingly positive connection. So really thankful for the renewal work they've done all of these years within the UMC. So I'll just quickly say my involvement with the UMC is not has been connected to friends and family members that have been involved in Wesleyanism. And had a lot of influence from my grandmother and my mom and others with Wesleyanism, particularly with Free Methodist. Have had a cousin that was a pastor with Free Methodist pastor for years and years, close to our family, and And then I'm distinctly remembering a time when a pastor came to one of our events when I was on staff at a church, a non-denominational church for 12 years in upstate New York. And he'd been positioned, appointed in our area from another United Methodist church from another location. And so he began coming to our pastoral gatherings and our church gatherings and joining in with other churches as well, and coming to some of our pastoral prayer times that were happening each week. And I remember there was 1 week when he just cried out in prayer that he feels there's a way in which he was feeling like kind of a pariah, and those are my words, I can't remember exactly what he said, but as a pastor of United Methodist Church, where so many people, so many denominations, so many other pastors assumed that he was not biblically based, that he was not orthodox, simply because he was aligned with the United Methodist Church. And it was the first time that I felt such a heart for this guy, this pastor who is ministering within a denomination that was really divided. That was, a long time ago, but really divided and dividing even more. And here he is, an Orthodox man, loving Jesus, following the scriptures, and yet had to battle that assumption that wherever he went within a lot of other conservative denominations, Orthodox denominations, it was assumed that somehow he was liberal in some fashion. And then to come on board and in 2016 with Transforming Congregations and realize, oh my goodness, like there are so many Orthodox, steadfast, Jesus-loving leaders and pastors within the UMC and lay leaders that I had no idea of to that extent. And I mean, so much so that the governance of the UMC is still Orthodox in its perspective, even though it's ignored, by many bishops and others in leadership. So anyway, that's been my foray, I guess, and then going to the General Conference in 2016, like 2 months after being hired, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is baptism by fire. 2 weeks of General Conference and sitting in on some of these committee meetings on human sexuality and the battle that was raging. It was a really interesting time. And then I remember, last thing I'll say here, I went to the specially called General Conference in 2019. And, and there you have Westboro Baptist, on the other corner of the street screaming at everybody going into the United Methodist General Session, calling all of us fags and queers and God hates you. I mean, just talk about, getting hit from kind of all sides, from progressive, pro-gay theology folks to Westboro Baptist screaming at us from the other corner. So it's been an interesting time. And yet I love how God is restoring and renewing and opening up a door through the GMC and through the Wesleyan Covenant Association for people to really gather of like mind and passion. And of course, that ultimately led, I think, to us, God bringing us together. And so here we are, our first podcast, and wanted to just kind of, begin the time and get back to our topic really of Pan-Wesleyan support and encouragement in the area of sexuality. Of course, at the root of sexuality is so often relational, either relational health that leads to solid, joyful sexual experience aligned with the way that God has created us, or it often leads to the opposite of that, right? So what would you want to share, Dee, just starting with you a little bit about this perspective of, rather than only focusing within the UMC or even the GMC, broadening out to some of the other denominations that really make up this Pan-Wesleyan movement?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, it's been a whirlwind of a time. I'm just reflecting on the timing of you jumping into conferences, for general conferences and things, Gary. Wow, that's really tough. So I grew up in a Methodist church, but didn't really know much about Methodism. It was a small little country church. And it wasn't until I started going to New Room conferences, and I think it was 2016 was my first New Room conference also, that I started hearing more about John Wesley and what his theology really was, and talking about the structure of the Methodist Church being built on class meetings and band meetings, and that was what he was being teased about having a method of church functioning in mutual accountability and building up disciples, and that he was mocked for that, and that's how Methodism got its name. I didn't know any of that until I went to the New Room Conference and started reading more and exploring more, and just found it fascinating and beautiful. And really that sparked a mini revival for myself, just being encouraged about the extravagant love of God and his forgiveness, and learning about that built-in accountability and discipleship, which I'd always hungered for. I'd experienced in a lot of great intervarsity meetings through college and through some great singles groups and Bible studies through the years. But the fact that the church structure that Wesley built was built on those types of purposeful, intentional gatherings for building one another up and getting to know people deeply in your church, and asking deep questions. How is it with your soul? People want to be known and loved, and that's a great way to guarantee that you will have someone asking you a question about how's your soul doing this week. In these kind of gatherings is a great way to be known and loved by people who are also wanting the same thing and that are on the same page spiritually. Is just fantastic. So that for me sparked off, again, just a deeper understanding of Wesleyanism in and of itself. And I love the model that Seedbed has taken, and their approach has been to equip the pan-Wesleyan, I guess, diaspora through these different denominations through the years for different reasons. And looking up the history, I've not found, I do a lot of research for the newsletter, so I'm used to digging in and researching. I've not found a great comprehensive resource for all the different splittings and recombinings of Methodism. The history is complicated and convoluted. And we've heard a little bit, Mark, you experienced that blending yourself of what formed the United Methodist Church. Well, that came out of all these other different traditions, but all from Wesleyanism. So I love being at the New Room conferences under Seedbed's spurring on of gathering us all with what we have in common in Wesleyan theology and equipping that. I just thought that was a brilliant move on their part once I understood more about Wesleyanism. And it makes total sense that this is the direction the Holy Spirit's moving us all in, is not just away from the United Methodist chaos, that the political infighting, but moving towards a greater, I guess, working out, living out of going back to the Methodist roots, of going back to those Wesleyan roots. And that's something all these different denominations have in common. Free Methodist, Congregational Methodist, Nazarene, Primitive Methodist Church, African Methodist. There's some remnants still in the UMC, Missionary Alliance, and there are a lot of different reasons for people to be in these different gatherings, but we all have the same theological core of agreement, and we're moving closer to reviving that accountable discipleship in different ways in different churches. So I've been, again, thrilled to be part of this reawakening to John Wesley. And on top of it, we have Charles' beautiful poetic hymnal repository that's just a core foundation for so many churches, too, that there's just this rich, I love how the arts are blended in through God's gifting of Charles with the solid theology of John also, and seeing that expounded as well in these different denominations. And we're creating new outreaches for ministry has been really thrilling to see also.
That's awesome. Thanks, Debra. As you're sharing, one of the things that comes to my mind is when we formed Love and Truth Network back in 2013, 3 years before I got involved in Transforming Congregations as the director there. One of the things that we felt like had been the richest blessing to, when I say we, me and my wife, to us and so many others that we knew, is when the church was really functioning more as, it really understood its role in culture as being a teaching hospital that, or even a MASH unit, this mobile unit that's on the front lines of culture, that's leaning into the brokenness, not running away from it. And yet so much of what I experienced growing up in a variety of churches, and over the years has been more of a church that was less engaged in culture and almost more of kind of digging back and hunkering into our our shelters and kind of waiting for the second coming of Christ or the rapture or whatever. And I one of the things along that line of the church being a teaching hospital, of being a mobile unit on the front lines of culture, years ago, I don't even remember what year the HBO special of Band of Brothers came out, but I've often thought that's what we need. We need that. Those bands of brothers, bands of sisters, that not 50 guys, but 4 or 5 men in my life and 4 or 5 women for women, who are, where nothing is off the table, where I can be fully known, and I'm not just can be, but I choose to be. I choose to drag the shameful stuff out. I choose to talk about not just my own sin areas, which are many, and where I was just dealing with sexual addiction of all kinds at one time. But I needed that band of brothers to really walk with me and to know me fully. And it's impossible to experience being fully loved unless we're fully known. And of course, the fully known isn't just all the good stuff. It's really the bad and the ugly. I mean, it's when we're fully known in those places and we're loved anyway. Not our sin isn't loved. It's not celebrated, but we are loved and we are celebrated, and people believe in the more that we can be in Christ. And then it's one of the things I really love about the Wesleyan perspective is that just what you talked about, that the groups, the bands. I had no idea, before getting involved in my role at TC within the UMC, of how that was a core belief that was communicated and foundational. And I'm like, oh, that so resonates. And it's such a blessing to know that the founder, the one that God used to really birth so much in the Wesleyan world, saw that as being absolutely essential. The bands, that being together, being honest, being vulnerable, and from there really receiving a true meal of relational connectedness and being known and being prayed for, being supported, and then being able to go out into the world and really reveal Christ. And I think so many of Christians today are living on fumes because they don't have that. They don't have those deep relationships. So that's one of my favorite things, honestly, about John Wesley and about the Pan Wesleyan perspective. Mark, how about you?
Well, building on what you both have just said there, back in the 70s, I think it was, there was a book written, "Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am?" by Father John Powell. And he described 5 levels of communication. The first level is cliche. The second one is the facts that I believe, just the facts. The third, the third level is what I believe about those facts. And then levels 4 and 5 are feelings and my truest self. And he said way back then that most Christian fellowship ends at the first 3, cliche, the facts, and what we believe. He said true change doesn't happen in our lives until we get down to the 4th and 5th levels, although you need a safe place to be able to get down, especially to the 5th level.
True.
So to your point, Gary, it is as we find a safe place to really open up about all of our stuff. And when it comes to sexual addiction, the second book that I failed to mention, Pure Hearted by Seedbed, it's a banned approach applied to sexual addiction because Patrick Carnes says that without spirituality, you will not get free from sexual addiction. Unfortunately, he recommends that you don't go to the church to find it. He said they'll just shame you. But in the banned approach, we have, and this book that I've written, it's informed by the dynamics of sexual addiction. It provides a place for deep openness and sharing of feelings, place to share our failures, and also has some inner healing prayers that help bring some freedom. But the Wesleyan message, as you both are saying, is we don't have to just get saved and try to find a way to get by. That there is transformation that's possible, and means of grace to help that change take place, and one of which is that deeper kind of fellowship that comes as we can be transparent.
Yeah. Well, hey, we are coming up really on the on 50 minutes here, so this time has flown by. But I would love to just to key off of what you're talking about there, Mark. It reminds me of some of the different perspectives within Wesleyanism, and I think it can be quite a controversial perspective depending on which you hold in regard to ongoing and progressive sanctification versus instantaneous sanctification. I think that winds up being kind of a sort of a bomb that goes off and sends sort of shrapnel everywhere and divides within the Wesleyan church. I mean, we all have it, right? Whether it's speaking in tongues in one camp and being a cessationist in another, or whatever. I mean, there's lots of different Calvinism versus Arminianism and all those. There are those beliefs that really do have the potential to really polarize us as Christians. And I think within the Wesleyan movement, that's one of them. And I would love for us to, and Dee, you brought this up prior to this conversation, but I would love for us to engage on that topic and, many others, the singleness topic. There's a lot of things that we touched on today, just even out of our own stories and our own history, my very limited history with the UMC, but yours that is much more substantive and has some longevity behind it. I would love to pick the conversation up and kind of unpack this a little bit more. But I think this was a really great opportunity for people to just get to know who I am and who you guys are, and a little bit, and understand that our desire isn't just to only focus in the UMC area or the GMC area, but really we want to have a broader approach to our brothers and sisters. And also, Mark, I loved what you said in regard to the even just mentioning that perspective that even so many good thought leaders, so many good disciples of Christ have really given the church kind of a black eye, as if the church is unable to come back from some of the places. Yes, the church needs to be strengthened, but that's just the point. We need to strengthen the church and bless the church. Not that we have all the answers by a long shot. The church is doing an amazing work in so many ways, and yet when it comes to the sexual arena, which every person on the planet participates in that, and being a sexual being, the church needs to really grow, and I think expand its perspective and expand its ministry offerings in those ways. So thanks so much for the conversation. Any last quick thing that you would like to add?
I would simply say, those of you in other Wesleyan denominations, there is certainly a struggle over the LGBTQ issues, and it's not going to go away. And we want to be a source of encouragement, a source of equipping, and we, even though we are coming from the United Methodist branch of the church, we are at one with you theologically, and at heart we desire to be as much help and support as we can in this very critical issue in these critical times.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks, Dee. Thanks, Mark. And so for our listeners, we just want, whether you're listening through Love and Truth Network podcast, or you're listening through the TC podcast, which again, that specifically is more dedicated to this area of Pan-Wesleyanism. We thank you for watching, for listening, and we hope you'll tune into our next podcast. Thanks so much.